For anyone just joining us, we have Professor Yeva Nersisyan, who will be talking with us about MMT and the Green New Deal. If I'm not mistaken, you're a professor at Franklin and Marshall College, Pennsylvania, and you're also part of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, which, along with Fidel Kaboub in the other room as well, I think. So yeah, handing over to you now. If you just click over to your slides to share. Um, Over to you.
There, it's working.
Yep, that's working fine.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about the Green New Deal, and my focus is going to be mostly on the United States because this presentation is based on a paper that Randy and I wrote a while back, trying to evaluate the affordability of the Green New Deal from the MMT perspective. And this question, in a way, came up because people like Paul Krugman were saying, well, MMT doesn't really help, even if you don't have to, even if the government is not financially constrained, you still have to raise taxes because of other reasons, such as inflation and so on, if you want to engage in major government spending programs. So we wanted to see whether it's true, whether a Green New Deal would actually be inflationary. And that's the way we wanted to evaluate its affordability. So I'm going to present some numbers here, but the numbers, there's a lot of uncertainty around the numbers because we're talking about major changes to the economy over a long period of time. And so the numbers are, of course, because of that, the numbers are going to be uncertain. What I'm going to argue for is the methodology that we use. And so even if the numbers aren't completely accurate, the methodology is solid and more useful than the mainstream methodology for evaluating the affordability of the Green New Deal. Now, before I start, I want to make sure we all know what we're talking about when we talk about the Green New Deal, because different people mean different things by it. And because the New Deal itself was an American thing, I just want to make sure we all know what that is. And the New Deal refers to the comprehensive set of reforms implemented by the Roosevelt administration in the United States during the Great Depression. This included financial regulations such as the Glass-Steagall Act, which has, of course, been since repealed. It established a social security system in the United States to provide retirement security for the elderly, as well as benefits to the disabled, the infirm, and so on. Of course, it also had public works programs, which were very successful, and they were green to some extent as well, because there were a lot of what we would today call green jobs involved there. So the Green New Deal echoes the original New Deal in that it's also a set of comprehensive reforms for reforming our economy, making it greener, but also making it more equal, increasing the affordability of housing, access to healthcare, affordable education, childcare, food, and so on and so forth. So it's very comprehensive, at least the version that was introduced by U.S. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and that's the version we stick to in our paper, and that's what I'm going to refer to in this presentation. So it also includes a job guarantee, which is what Fadel is talking about in the other session. And a job guarantee has, of course, been an important component of modern money theory for various reasons, such as, price stability, among other things. So I'm going to talk about three main parts of the Green New Deal: greening the economy over 10 years, which is a very ambitious plan. Oftentimes people talk about greening it over 30 years, so achieving some kind of green economy by 2050. We're sticking to a shorter timeline, 10 years. We're also going to talk about universal health care. Now, in European context, many countries already have universal health care. In the US, it's, we call it a Medicare for all, because we already have universal health care for the elderly, people over 65, but we don't have it for everyone. So that's the Medicare program. So Medicare for all is basically universal health care, and European countries have it to some extent. They also have, some kind of childcare, access to childcare or subsidies for childcare. care, access to free or subsidized public education, and so on. So things that we don't have in the United States. So in the US context, those things would be included in the Green New Deal, while in European context, when people talk about the Green New Deal, they are largely sticking to transitioning to a greener economy, renewable energy, and so on and so forth. So these are the three main components of the Green New Deal that I'm going to talk about today. So when the Green New Deal resolution was introduced, economists started and think tanks started crunching numbers. Are we going to be able to afford it? And one of the often cited numbers was this $93 trillion number from a conservative think tank, which added up all the costs of the different programs. So estimate the costs of Medicare for all, greening, and others, and just add them up and come up with this outrageous number, $93 trillion over 10 years, and say that, of course, it's not affordable, and that then calculate the average increase or the per capita increase in taxes. So how much the average American needs to pay in taxes to be able to afford it. And of course, it comes to a very high number. So that was one objection to the Green New Deal. The other one, which is more reasonable, is the objection that it could be inflationary. Well, why would it be inflationary? So if the Green New Deal, if implementing it, pushed the aggregate spending in the economy above the economy's potential, then it could potentially be inflationary. So in this case, the blue line is the measure of economy's potential GDP, and there are many issues with estimating potential GDP. If I have time, I'll get to some of those at the end. And this is our actual GDP. So if actual GDP is below potential, we have unemployment, and this is usually because there is not enough spending in the economy. So if there is not enough spending, not enough production happens, and not enough people are employed. While on the other hand, if the actual GDP goes above the potential of the economy, then there could be some inflation. And of course, this is what was happening before COVID, and we didn't really see that much more inflation. So, this is the framework that people use when they think about why the Green New Deal could be inflationary, but it's not an ideal framework. There are many issues with this. Now, how does MMT help? So going back to Krugman's point that MMT does not really help. Well, MMT helps by putting the financial considerations aside, right? Saying that for a country with its sovereign currency, such as the United States, but also the UK, money is not an issue, finance is not a constraint. Households and firms are currency issuers. They are financially constrained. The government, currency users, I'm sorry, while the government is the currency issuer, and therefore it's not financially constrained. As Randy explained, government spends money into existence, and that amounts to changing numbers on a computer in the kind of electronic monetary system that we have today. So for countries with their own sovereign currency, finance is not an issue. What is at issue here is whether they have the real resources they need to implement such programs. Because to green the economy, of course, we need to have more wind turbines and more solar panels, and we need workers to build them, and then we need workers to install them, and then we need to reform our electric grid, and then we need to reform our transportation system. So we need a lot of resources for that, and that includes human resources such as workers, but also others. So the question from the MMT perspective, this is the important question: do we have the resources, and do we have the technological know-how to implement these programs? And if we don't, money is not going to be very helpful. And if we do, then finance is not really a constraint for the government. So this is the MMT approach to any kind of government spending, right? And in this case, we're applying that to the Green New Deal. So we're asking the question of whether the Green New Deal is going to require more resources than we can spare, right? And if the answer is yes, then what can we do about it? Okay, do we need to raise taxes? Do we need some other measures to do it? That's really the question. So to answer this question, however, we can't just say, oh, well, if if we're going to spend so much, then it's going to be inflationary. We need to do some more careful study for that. And that's what we tried to do in our paper with Randy. We tried to estimate whether the Green New Deal would actually require more resources than we can spare, and whether all of the Green New Deal programs, all of the components that I mentioned at the beginning, whether they're all going to need resources or whether some of them will actually release resources to be used in the others. And it seems abstract now when I talk about it, but I will explain further when I get to the individual programs, components of the Green New Deal, and hopefully it will be clearer. So the first component that I mentioned was greening the economy. And of course, greening the economy is going to use resources. And in our paper, we are using the amount of spending as a proxy for resources, right? So if we're going to be spending more to hire workers, then we're using human resources, right? So that's a use of resources. So we're looking at the level of spending as a proxy for resource use. It's not ideal, but it's what's possible given that we're going to talk about different kinds of programs. So there are different estimates of how much it's going to cost to completely green the economy, and we took the highest three estimates, and we took an average of that, and then we just subtracted how much we currently spend on fossil fuels, right? Because if we're going to green the economy, that means we're no longer going to spend on fossil fuels. We're no longer going to invest in that sector. So that's going to free up some resources. So, for example, if we're not going to need workers to dig up oil from the ground, then those workers will be available to build wind turbines and install solar panels and so on, right? So that's just a simple example of that. So and that's why the fossil fuel investment that we're currently engaging in enters into the equation with a negative sign, because yes, on the one hand, we're going to need 5.6% of our GDP per year for 10 years. That's how much we need to spend to green the economy. On the other hand, we are releasing 0.65% of GDP worth of resources because we're no longer investing in fossil fuels. So on net, the greening the economy costs about 5% of US GDP for 10 years. So 5% every year for 10 years. And that seems like a very high number. And if you just look at it, and if the economy is already close to full employment, you might say, well, then this could be inflationary for certain, right? And therefore, even from the MMT perspective, it's unaffordable because it's inflationary. However, there are other components of the Green New Deal, such as the job guarantee and Medicare for all, which may actually be a source of resources, not a use of resources. So the job guarantee is sort of in the middle, as I will explain, and Medicare for all will actually release resources, as I will explain when I get to that. So what is the job guarantee? Very simply, it's a federally funded government program that says anyone who wants a job can get one. The government pays for it, but it's implemented at the local level through local governments, through non-government organizations, which are on the ground, and therefore they know better what the community needs. Now, from the financial perspective, of course, the job guarantee is a cost, right? So if you just look at it as a financial thing, you say, well, it's going to cost the government more, right? It's going to have to pay workers their salaries, their benefits, and so on. So we're going to, as a society, be spending more on this program. And of course, then these workers are going to buy food and other stuff, clothing, right? Pay for housing and so on. So they're going to be taking some resources, right? So from that perspective, it's going to use resources. But on the other hand, we can employ some of these job guarantee workers in greening projects, such as retrofitting houses, for example, right? So things that don't necessarily require a lot of skill, because the assumption is that the job guarantee workers would be the ones who don't have a lot of the skills, or at least they don't have the skills that the private sector requires. So if we use half of the job guarantee workers toward greening projects, then that means we're, let's say, if we're spending 2% of GDP on the job guarantee, but then we're taking half of that back into the greening projects, then the net cost of the job guarantee will only be 1% of GDP. Okay. All right. Now, with Medicare for all, and that's again universal health care in the United States, we actually can release resources. And here is a chart of how much different nations spend on their health care. And you might not be able to see the labels, but you don't even need to know that this is the United States, right? We are spending a lot more than other developed countries on healthcare. The next country that's closer to us, it's Switzerland, and it's only spending about 12% of its GDP on healthcare. In case of the US, that number was 17%. Today it's probably higher, closer to 18%, and it's projected to keep increasing at a pretty fast pace. So if we were to have a universal healthcare system, we could actually reduce our spending, right? And a simple way to do this would be to say, well, if we just take this to the level that other countries that have a single payer system have, so some kind of an average of European nations, right? So if we could lower it from, say, 17% to even 12%, which is the Switzerland, right? Then we are taking 5% of GDP worth of spending out of the economy, right? So that then releases resources that can be used in other projects. But that's not the route we went. We just looked at some other estimates of how much a Medicare for all would save us. And the savings range from about 1.6% of GDP to 4.5% of GDP, depends on the assumptions. But what is really driving the excessive spending in the United States on healthcare? And what's driving it is administrative costs and prices. So price of drugs, and that's very well known that in the United States, medications cost a lot more than in other countries. And that's because we don't have a single payer that can negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. Even Medicare cannot negotiate with pharmaceutical companies to lower their prices, which is, of course, not the case in European countries that have single payer systems, where the government does negotiate with drug companies and does reduce prices that way. Compensation of healthcare workers is, of course, also higher in the United States. And here are some numbers if you're interested, and it's from this study that I mentioned here, and you can find it in our paper. And the other thing that contributes to higher costs in the United States is administrative costs, which is about 8% of total healthcare spending versus 1 to 3% in other countries. So we're spending a lot more on administering our healthcare system because it's a very peculiar system with different participants. So doctors' offices have spent a lot on billing, right? Trying to get payments from insurance companies, trying to get payments from the government, payments from patients, getting their co-pays and deductibles and all of those things. And also, on the private health insurance side, right? All of that adds costs because, if insurance companies are to make money, then, their income is someone's spending. And that's, all of us collectively spending the income that then the insurance companies are earning. So if we take the insurance companies out of the equation, of course, that's then going to save us a lot as well. Now, in practical terms, right? So translating this into resource use, how does this help with, say, greening the economy? How does this release resources for greening the economy? Well, if you have workers who are now administering the healthcare system, right? If we were to lower the spending on administrative costs, then we would be these workers would basically end up losing their jobs, right? And so, their income goes down, their spending goes down, and so on and so forth, and it has ripple effects throughout the economy. So, but thinking about it from the workers' perspective, if these workers are no longer employed in the health insurance industry, they can now be employed in, say, administering the Green New Deal, right? Or doing something else for greening the economy, for instance. So that's how a Medicare for all or a single payer system would end up releasing resources that could be used in other parts, for other components of the Green New Deal. So in other words, not all of the components of the Green New Deal are going to enter the equation with a plus sign. Some of them will enter with a minus sign because they are leading to a decrease of spending in the economy, not an increase, right? So a program that is decreasing spending in the economy is going to be deflationary, not inflationary. And when economists like Krugman think about this from the financial perspective, of course, financially, the government is going to be spending more, but it doesn't matter whether the government is spending more. What matters is the total level of spending, right? If the government is spending more, but the private sector is spending less, then it need not be inflationary. So here is our summary table. So we budget 5% per year for 10 years for greening the economy. The job guarantee on net adds another 1%. Medicare for all, by very conservative measures, will save about 3.7%. So it's going to lower spending to the tune of 3.7% of GDP. We also have a provision for ending the forever wars that the US has been engaged in, because people like Bernie Sanders, who's also an advocate for the Green New Deal, has been also advocating for ending the forever wars, and so have been the other advocates for the Green New Deal. And we, again, conservatively project that that's going to save us another 1% of GDP per year for the next 10 years. So the net resource cost then comes out to about 1.3% of GDP, which is, of course, much less than the 5% that you look at. And of course, it's much less than the $93 trillion that the conservatives think tank that I mentioned was estimating that's how much it was going to cost us over 10 years. All right. So this is the MMT approach to estimating the affordability of the Green New Deal. Of course, tackling the climate change is not the first time that humans have faced with an existential crisis. We can think back to World War II, which was also a crisis which we which required a lot of economic resources, right? It wasn't it was also an economic crisis, so to speak, that required planning and required mobilization of resources, much more than what we need for the Green New Deal and fighting the climate change, actually. So this is why we turn to Keynes and his approach in how to pay for the war, a short pamphlet he wrote explaining how we can pay for World War II. And pay for here really is not about finance, it's about resources, as I will explain. And his approach is very much like the MMT approach, right? So Keynes is basically saying that planning for the war is not a financial but a real resource problem. The question is, how much output can we produce? How much of that we absolutely have to devote to the war effort? Whatever is left is what's left for consumption. If we want to consume more than that, we can't, right? Because that's, the pie is limited, it's fixed. So we go from the age of plenty to the age of scarcity. Now we actually need to try to ration this limited economic pie to prevent inflation, because during the war, more people are employed and incomes increase, right? So the amount that the government is spending, right? Let's say it's we're producing ammunition and the government is going to buy it, right? And people are employed in the production process, they earn income, but they cannot then turn and spend that income on buying ammunition, right? The government is going to buy that. And so that income is just left and cannot find stuff to buy. And if everybody tries to spend their income, what's going to happen is that we're going to simply see inflation. And in real terms, people's standard of living is not going to improve. They're going to spend more of their nominal income buying the same amount of real stuff because the real stuff is fixed. So Keynes looks for solutions and he says, well, we can use taxes and we can tax away some of that income to prevent inflation, but we cannot just rely on taxing the rich, because the rich are not, it's not going to be sufficient. It's not going to take out sufficient amount of income from the economy to prevent inflation. He says we can also try to rely on people saving voluntarily. Again, not a great idea unless everybody does it, and there is no guarantee that they will do, because if I save and you don't, and you spend the income, that's still going to be inflationary. And of course, then the value of my savings is going to decrease in real terms as well. Prices go up, workers demand higher wages, which then simply play catch up with inflation. And then workers are no better off in real terms. So what Keynes proposed and what was implemented in the UK to some extent was deferred compensation or forced savings. So tax away income, but put some of it, well, not put some of it, but say that, some of it is just taxes, you lose it, but some of it you're going to get back with interest after the war, right? And so after the war, you can increase consumption. And in that case, you actually also avoid a post-war slump. And I can, of course, go more in detail into any of this if necessary, if there are questions, but I don't want to get too much into that. So so the deferred compensation approach is something that we also say could be applied if necessary to the Green New Deal. Advocates of the Green New Deal call for increasing taxes on the rich, imposing taxes on financial transactions, offshore income, corporate profits, on wealth, and so on. This may be very good in fighting income inequality, right? And to the extent that that's also a goal of the Green New Deal advocates, then sure, we should implement them, but we should not make greening the economy or implementing universal healthcare conditional on these taxes, right? And these taxes are not going to be very useful in withdrawing income from the economy because the rich are too rich, right? And even if you tax them a lot, they still have a lot of wealth and a lot of income, and they can still take a lot of the society's resources, right? So if the goal is to reduce resources, taxing the rich is not necessarily going to do the trick. On the other hand, if you were to tax workers, it would be very effective in withdrawing income because it would lead to lower consumption. But of course, that would also not be fair, especially in the United States and in many other developed countries. Workers have not been doing very well in the last few decades. Productivity has gone up and worker wages have not, and the average incomes have stagnated, and so on and so forth. So we propose a payroll tax surcharge, but we also want to model it like Keynes's deferred compensation. So take more from workers today to reduce consumption today, if necessary, to fight inflation, and then in the future give workers more of that back in the form of more generous retirement benefits. Okay. Again, this is all conditional because it's not really clear that the economy cannot take in more spending before we get to a point of true inflation, and Randy defined true inflation in his presentation. If we do get to true inflation, then we can use something like deferred compensation, but we also have other methods that we used during World War II pretty successfully because inflation rates were not too high, even though the degree of mobilization was enormous, right, during World War II. So if we were to impose that payroll tax surcharge, and we have the numbers in the paper, then the net cost would actually be negative. So the Green New Deal with a payroll tax surcharge would actually be deflationary, not inflationary. Okay. All right. The one thing that I will say, and this goes back to the question of potential GDP before I finish, is that the economy's potential is not fixed, right? And this graph here shows the forecast for potential GDP, the blue line, in January of 2007. So when the economy was doing really well, the forecast was that this is how the economy's trajectory, this is what the trajectory would be, right? And then when the economy started not doing well because of the financial crisis and the Great Recession, then the forecast for the potential was lowered up to the point where the green line was, the forecast for potential GDP as of January 2019. And of course, as you can imagine, it was lowered again with the COVID pandemic. The forecast for potential GDP was lowered as well. But the point is that if we had kept demand high in the economy in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and the economy had continued at this path, this is where our potential GDP would be today, right? So higher than what our estimates for the potential are because of the economic mismanagement, which led to the decrease in the potential. And there are other issues with estimating, potential GDP that I don't want to go into. So just because spending surpasses the economy's potential doesn't, as measured, conventionally doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see inflation. We've had many periods um, um, with our actual GDP going over the potential GDP without seeing the kind of inflation that the simple economic model predicts that we're going to see. Okay, so in other words, the economy's potential to absorb spending is not as fixed, and it's not as limited as mainstream theory suggests, and the estimates that are based on this mainstream theory suggest as well. To summarize, Keynes believed that his proposal for financing for the war would snatch from the exigency of the war positive social improvements and advance towards economic equality greater than any which we have made in recent times. And to some extent, he was right. In the United States, at least, we had this economic boom after World War II, of course, the golden age of U.S. capitalism, at least by based on economic indicators. There were many issues back then, of course, social justice issues and so on. Now, the Green New Deal promises a similar outcome. The benefits, of course, go far beyond the reversal of climate change if we do it right. And as I said at the beginning, I showed some numbers, but the numbers aren't what's important. What's important is the framework which MMT helps us create for understanding the affordability of government programs such as the Green New Deal. The numbers may be uncertain, but our methodology is solid and it's much more useful for evaluating the affordability of the Green New Deal than the traditional approach of just calculating financial costs and adding them up, or calculating how much more the government is going to spend and then how much more taxes need to go up and so on and so forth. So I will stop here and see if there are any questions, and I can go back to the PowerPoint if need be.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that, Professor Nersisyan. That was really insightful, I think. Um, okay, there's one question I can see here, but I'll just before that one, I'll ask a question that should lead into that. A criticism I've seen quite a lot, particularly when back when AOC and Ed Markey initially launched their Green New Deal proposal, um, from both the right and sort of non-MMT progressive, was that it's not just a green investment program they're lumping in, or they call it like a socialist wish list or a progressive wish list. They're putting in healthcare, they're putting in job guarantees, childcare, all these other things. What would your argument be for why it should be the Green New Deal incorporating all those things rather than separating it out to get different constituencies on board for each of those individual things?
Well, what I was trying to explain is that a comprehensive approach is a better economic approach as well, because if you just implement, say, Medicare for all, right, universal health care, then it can be deflationary, right? It can reduce spending from the economy, and if and lower spending means lower income for others, right? Because someone's spending is someone else's income, and that means fewer jobs and so on. So it could lead to unemployment. So if, let's say, you're cutting the health insurance sector, you're lowering the amount we spend on administration, right? All of these workers would find themselves unemployed, for instance. While if you're combining that with say greening the economy, on the other hand, which is going to lead to a demand on resources, right? We need more workers for that, for to implement that. In other words, it would be inflationary, or it could be inflationary potentially if implemented on its own, right? So one is inflationary, one is deflationary, and the two together offset each other to some extent, right? So if we need 5% of GDP to green the economy, but we are releasing 3.7% by implementing universal health care, then of course we're going to end up with a better outcome than if we just did them separately. But I would also say that the New Deal itself, right? The reason why it's called a New Deal is because it's supposed to be comprehensive, right? It's supposed to be progressive, and it's supposed to include a lot of the stuff that are on the progressive wish list, right? Now, whether politically it's more appropriate to do them separately or individually, apparently even the Biden administration is currently struggling with that, whether to introduce an infrastructure bill separately to get more support, say from Republicans, and then to introduce a separate bill for paid leave and universal pre-K education and so on and so forth. So they're also trying to separate them. I would say from the MMT perspective, at least, it's better to combine them. And there are different versions of the Green New Deal. Some are more comprehensive, others are less comprehensive. Which one you choose, I guess, also depends on your ideology, but also on the politics question. Um, I can't really answer the politics question, right? Which one will be more appropriate or not politically? That I don't know. Like maybe it's better to do the infrastructure plan separately and then worry about the rest, right? But economically speaking, it's better to do them together, I would say.
Okay, yeah. So just following on from that, as you say, sort of the job guarantee is part of that Green New Deal proposal. Ken is asked, I assume he's referring to the job guarantee component. When people are given jobs as part of that scheme, he's saying, do we pay manual workers less than knowledge workers? So I guess is the job guarantee just, you set it at like a minimum wage standard, and that's no matter what sort of job you're allocated, it would be the same, or are you going to have different roles with different pay and benefits within that system?
Well, I think so. We can distinguish between public employment, right? So people who will become part of a bigger government because of a Green New Deal, and then the job guarantee, right? So do we need more engineers? Sure. Are they going to be part of the job guarantee? No, right? So you're going to hire a lot of workers to implement your Green New Deal, right? The job guarantee is for workers who cannot. Oops, people are saying they cannot hear the questions. So I can if people can hear me, I can repeat the question then. So the question was, do you pay different people with different? Yeah. So the question was, do you need to pay people with different skills in the job guarantee, or is the job guarantee just for minimum wage workers, right? So my answer would be that the Green New Deal would lead to a bigger government, and which is not necessarily more workers employed by the government, by the public sector, which is not a part of the job guarantee, right? So if you need engineers, you need to hire engineers, and so on. So they're going to be hired by the government, not as a part of the job guarantee, but like the government hires anybody else that it needs, right? Currently. The workers who are unable to find that kind of employment or employment in the private sector then can be employed in the job guarantee. So the job guarantee is for people who are unable to find public or private employment, right? It's an employer of last resort in Minsky's words. So if you can't find that other kind of employment, you're able to find employment there. Now, the job guarantee proposal that we included in our paper is modeled with a $15 an hour wage, which would then become the new minimum wage. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, there's another question here from Eric. It's quite a long one. Does the Green New Deal and MMT take into account planetary boundaries, and to what extent does it, if so? And does it assume, as mentioned by Professor Ray, learners' sustainable growth is necessary? So sort of talking about the ecological economics perspective there, about the sort of degrowth and green growth. Does MMT sort of overlap with those perspectives, or is there another approach to that kind of degrowth perspective? I think that's what he's kind of asking there. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Shall I repeat the question? in case people didn't hear it. So the question was if MMT and the Green New Deal takes into account the ecological limits of planet Earth, basically, right? And then, if it's compatible with degrowth and green growth and so on. I would say Green New Deal is green growth, right? So the economy will be growing, but it will be doing so, it will be green growth because we will be trying to green the economy. Now, thinking about the ecological limits, fighting climate change, right, is thinking about the ecological limits of the of the uh, of, of the planet, right? That we cannot continue with our fossil fuel economy the way we have done. And even now, it may be too late, right? If we started tomorrow and did it for over 10 years, I don't even know if that's not too late anymore because of, the processes that have already been, set in place and whether that's going to stop. Now, the option, I think the option that we need to choose from, right? It's not that we're going to go and live like cavemen and women, right? Versus the current economy. So given the options that we have, a capitalist economy, right, which is not going anywhere anytime soon. So working within that framework, I would say a Green New Deal is our best option for trying to prevent an ecological catastrophe. And to the extent that it leads to a more equitable distribution of income, then it's better for everyone and probably for the environment too. Now, you can also, it's so the Green New Deal doesn't have to be the only thing, right? So if you don't want people to use plastics, you can regulate that, right? You can try to get rid of plastics like some countries have done. So it's not a panacea. If you want to do other things in addition to that, you should, right? So that would be my answer.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have time for one last question there. I'm leaning in because somebody was just saying my mic was quite quiet. I think that should be better. So one last question is education for trades or academics included within the Green New Deal? I think that's because often people will think Green New Deal, job guarantee, it's kind of shovel ready, working on roads and that kind of old school New Deal kind of jobs. Do you see that the Green New Deal would involve other roles for academics and education within that as well?
So not within the job guarantee, right? So again, the job guarantee would be for those who are unable to find regular public or private employment. But of course, we are going to need a lot of experts like we did during the New Deal. And the New Deal, recruited a whole host of academics and non-academics. They also recruited people who were involved in planning World War I, right? There was an understanding that the economy can't just be left on its own. It needs to be planned. If you want to do things like the New Deal and later the World War II, right? There was a lot of planning that was happening. So to some extent, we need to bring back planning, right? We need to sit down and understand what we need to do and whose expertise we need for that. Of course, we're going to need scientists, right? Climate scientists, people who work on renewable energy and so on. Like of course, I'm no expert on that, right? I know very little about that. On the other hand, you also need economists, right, to hopefully not mainstream, to plan the economic side of things. So if that was the question, then sure, we're going to need that. Was there like a second part to the question that I missed?
No, I don't think so. Is education for trades or academics included within the Green New Deal? There's just one last question, which I think we can just squeeze in if you're okay. Has inflation picked up in America after the large COVID spending packages? And do you think that will be a problem, I guess?
Yeah. Well, that's been there's been a pretty big debate about that recently. Most people, including mainstream economists, are saying no, there's not going to be a lot of inflation. People like Larry Summers and even Oliver Blanchard were the two prominent economists who were saying it could be inflationary. Summers, I guess now is saying there is an equal chance that it will be inflationary and it won't be inflationary. And when they're talking about inflation, they're talking about, runaway inflation, the kind that we saw in the 1970s, the kind that the Fed cannot tackle without, and that they think the Fed should tackle and cannot tackle without killing the economy like they did in the 1970s. What they forget is that the economy has changed. We have this, more globalized economy where we're able to tap into cheap labor in China, and that's what's really in other countries, and that's really kept prices low in the United States. And that we haven't really seen a lot of inflation with the COVID stimulus packages. The inflation is, for the inflationary hawks, inflation is always around the corner. Even when that prescription doesn't materialize, it's again around the corner, around the next corner, and so on. But of course, they never tire of predicting inflation, hyperinflation. So my view, and I would say Randy probably shares that view too, is that we're not going to see a lot of inflation. Will it go above the 2% to say 3%? Probably, it's possible. Is 3% a cause for concern? I would say no. And even the Fed has signaled that they're not going to take action if inflation is above their 2% target for a limited amount of time. They're going to look at some kind of an average inflation. And if you look at the average inflation rate since 1990 in the United States, it's been about 2.2%, right? And it's not going to accelerate anytime soon, I don't think.
Okay. All right, excellent. That brings us up to time. So, really appreciate you joining us today, Professor Nersisyan.